Welcome everyone to this Pearson English webinar. Thank you for joining us today. You can also join the conversation online with the hashtag #ReadyForWebinars. Please remember this session is recorded and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel after the event. Also, every participant will receive a certificate of attendance. Please submit any questions you have in the chat box and we will answer these at the end of this session. Without further delay, I'm excited to hand over to Nick, who's going to tell us about choosing the right assessments. Thank you, Nick. Over to you.
Thanks, Charlie, and hello, everyone. I am joining from sunny Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the Midwest of the United States. I was telling Charlie it is -4 degrees Celsius here, so it is cold, but I'm excited to be spending my time focused on this conversation versus being outside. So thanks for everyone for telling us where you're joining from. So if you want to put that in there, yes, Burr is exactly right. Lithuania, Poland, Russia, thank you very much. Spain, Germany, so on and so forth. But as we get started, I do want to acknowledge the unprecedented and scary times that we are living in. I also want to use this opportunity to hopefully wish you all happy holidays prematurely, but also ensure that wishing you all the best in terms of health and making sure that you and your family and colleagues are safe wherever you are in the world. It's also important to recognize and thank all the folks working in the education space, right? We've had to all adapt quite substantially because of COVID, distance learning, and so on and so forth. I'm thankful to the teachers who are supporting my two children, and obviously all the educators who are on this call, who are doing the very best to ensure that we can continue to teach, educate, motivate, and upskill students all around the world. So thank you very much for everything you do. We've had to adapt a little bit at Pearson as well. You'll hear a little bit about new products that we're rolling out. If you haven't already joined some of the webinars, you'll learn about remote proctoring. But today we are here to talk about assessment and how do you make sure that you select the right assessment. So my name is Nick Laul. I lead the product management team for our English proficiency assessment portfolio. I've got 20 years of experience working in assessment. Obviously, I'm working in English assessment now, but previously I've worked supporting secondary assessment and high school exit exams, as well as on the professional space with certification and licensure. And what I'm going to share with you is kind of my view of how you distill the information that you are presented with and determine how to select the right assessment for you. So thank you for joining me for the next 30 minutes. Let's have a conversation and do use the chat to write your feedback, present your viewpoint, agree, disagree with what I'm saying, and provide expertise that you might have for your particular situation. So before we get started, I want to pose a question to you, and please feel free to put the answers in the chat. Which of these assessments do you consider to be high-stakes tests? Is it the medical license test, an English class placement test, college entrance, driver's license, job placement, or in-class progress test? Which of these, including multi-select, would you consider these to be high-stakes based on your definition of high-stakes? If somebody's saying all, others saying college entrance, in-class progress, all of them. Yeah, driver's license because jobs are at risk, all of them. Thank you, thank you. And that is, from my perspective, correct. I would call all of them high stakes tests. Let's talk a little bit about that. So why do I say that? You know, when we think about stakes, many times we think about sitting in a high pressure situation, in a testing room, surrounded by other people around you, and you're spending a dedicated 1 or 2 hours taking a test. And that is definitely one definition, and a correct definition of what high stakes involves, right? It involves taking a test where the output means something substantial. But I would argue that our mindset around assessment needs to change a little bit, because all of those situations I talked about, right? All of those 6 situations, the output of that, no matter what it is, has a life-altering impact to the student, right? Be it a placement test. So when you are placing a student, it could be the difference between doing extracurricular English for 6 months and not doing it, right? Obviously, a driver's license, because it gets to decide whether you drive a car and whether you're safe, a safe driver to be out in the streets, and so on and so forth. So our mindset has to be, anytime we could deliver an assessment, right? So my son was taking a science quiz yesterday. It's a big deal. It's a big deal because it has an impact, whether he does well or not, on his mental state. It has an impact on his confidence. All of those things have a significant impact to the learner. And that's the way we should be thinking about it. We should think about, anytime that we deliver an assessment, there is a output and an impact to the student taking it, and therefore selecting the right assessment is critical. And that is the reason we are here, that we're actually equipped to select the right assessment based on the needs. And today, actually, we're talking about English assessments, right? So just to focus on today is all about English assessment, and it's also about English course agnostic proficiency assessments. So these are add-on assessments that aren't part of your normal courseware or what comes along with your courseware. So selecting the right assessment, I would say, is actually quite simple, right? Who are you testing, right? So knowing your student population, are they young learners or they adults, right? As an example. Really understanding, what do you want to know? Why are they taking the test? What conclusions or interpretations are you trying to draw from the data? What is the end result you're looking for? And lastly, what barriers or challenges do you face around the assessment process? So if you just think of that as a construct, it'll make selecting the assessment a lot simpler. So before you get started, before you start looking at assessments, here are the things you should consider. And lastly, it's really important to know all assessments are not the same. And I'll just give you an example. If you look at the Pearson English assessment portfolio, we have a lot of assessments. You can see all of those on the screen. They all measure English, and they do a very, very good job doing that. But they're certainly not the same. And what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is walk you through a framework that I believe you can use and the kinds of questions you need to ask to ensure that you are selecting the right assessment for the right purpose. So I have summarized kind of my experience into these 7 factors, right? So these are the kinds of factors that I believe you should consider. We'll go through them in a little bit more detail, but if in the chat, if you want to provide your perspective on, based on your situation, your experience, which of these factors are most important to you, I think that'd be good. So as I'm talking through them, I have a little bit of context in terms of how you think about assessment and how you determine what assessments to select and what factors to consider. So please put those in the chat. So the first is what we're going to call test construct. It's basically about what you're measuring. The next is the length of the test, followed by the delivery model, whether you're using paper or digital as an example. A channel, which is how it's delivered, where it's made accessible. And the next 2 are outcome and risk. So what information are you trying to draw from the test itself, and what is the risk of malpractice and getting it wrong? And the last is price and affordability. So those are the 7 things that I'm going to talk about a little bit, and hopefully provide you a little bit of context on the type of questions to consider under each of those. And as we're going through it, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, or if you'd like clarifications or want to provide your perspective, I'd encourage you to share that through the chat mechanism as well. So let's start with number 1, right? It's test construct. And test construct is all about coverage, content coverage and what exactly you're trying to measure, right? So a very simple way to think about it is skills, right? We talk a lot about 2 skills, 3 skills, and 4 skills tests. Well, what do you want to measure? You want to measure all 4 skills. Now, generally at Pearson, most of our assessments are 4 skills tests, and we use a very integrated skills communication measurement type approach, right? So we're actually measuring your ability to communicate and use the English that you have learned. That's the way our assessments are designed, is using a very integrated skills framework to try and measure your ability to use English in the situation. But you got to think of other things as well. Are you measuring general English? Are you measuring English that is used in the workplace, right? A business English or professional English, as an example. And then the last thing is all about content coverage, right? So depending on what you have covered in class or as part of your curriculum, what exactly is the correlation between what you're teaching in the classroom and what you are measuring, right? So if a student is spending an hour a week learning general English, giving them a professional English test, which talks about scenarios that they aren't familiar with, would be a mismatch, and you'd get data that is incongruent or not applicable to what you've been teaching. So those are the kind of questions you need to consider about what I would call test construct or content coverage to ensure that you're selecting the right test. The second one is the length of the test. And this is actually quite simple, right? So the longer the test, the greater precision we can provide around the score itself, right? So by default, and this is just data and measurement, right, practices, the more information and the more data elements or data points I can get, the greater confidence I have in the outcome of the data or the inferences I'm drawing from that data. So think about you're throwing darts at a dartboard, right? I'm not very good at darts, but I can throw a dart, and let's assume I throw one dart, I might get a bullseye. And if you use that as a way to draw inferences about my dart throwing abilities, you would be wrong, right? On the other hand, if I have to throw 100 darts, you can draw a much more accurate inference about my skills throwing darts. And that's exactly where the test length comes in. The more data points we can collect, which in this case means more items, which equates to length of the test, the greater confidence I have that I have removed any noise or error that might have crept in the assessment process or in the data gathering process, which is quite reasonable. However, it's not as simple as that, right? Because ideally, I'd like to deliver 2, 3, 4 hour tests all the time. Well, that's not reasonable, right? You can't use that every time and carve out a 2-hour period once a month or 2-hour test period once a month to try and take tests for every subject, right? That's not going to work. So that's where you have to make trade-offs. And you will see that theme across the board whenever I'm talking about this stuff. This is not a black or white situation. In the end, there are trade-offs to be made around all 7 factors that I'll be talking about. And what you have to determine is what trade-offs are you willing to make and what are the factors that are most important to you for your situation, for your candidate population, and so on and so forth. So that's number 2, which is the length of the test. The third one is delivery model, right? So this comes in 2 forms. One is, do you want to deliver a paper test or a digital test? Because those are both quite ubiquitous. Most of our tests are digital in nature because we believe digital allows for easier and quicker scoring. It allows for more on-demand testing and provides easy access to data. But doesn't mean digital is the only solution for certain situations. Paper is a easier option. So single day delivery, right? So if you are trying to deliver 15,000 tests on a single day, digital is sometimes a tougher thing to do because you will need to get thousands and thousands of computers. If you want everyone to start on time and take 15,000 tests at the same time, you're going to need 15,000 computers which might be hard to do. In that case, a paper test might be easier because you have everyone starting at the same time in a single room and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if you're thinking about on-demand testing, right? So testing that's happening whenever the student wants to take it, digital might be easier because then you're not worried about shipping paper back and forth, as an example. So once again, there is a push and pull here, and determine based on your situation, which is the right need for you. It's also important to keep in mind that some modes are a little bit more candidate friendly, right? So here is an example of a test that we have. It's a 4 skills young learners assessment. And essentially this is for kids between the ages of 6 and 12. And it's an English proficiency test, but it is tablet based and it's a gamification of a test, right? So it's a gamified test and it's a gamified experience where you're touching things, you're dropping things, you're typing stuff onto the iPad, and it feels more like an activity and a game as opposed to taking a test. And it's pretty fun because a student is interacting with the iPad as if they're actually playing a game. But the activities they're doing allow us to measure the English language proficiency, including speaking into the iPad. So we're actually able to capture the speech and use our AI-based scoring technology to score the test. And because it's AI-based, within minutes, the teacher receives a full profile of the candidate and all the candidates in his or her classroom. So it's a great way of making a test much more achievable and less and reduce anxiety for students, right? Because anytime a student has to go in and take what feels like a test, there is anxiety. And here they're going in and they feel like they're playing a game or interacting with the game, but in reality, they're actually doing, speaking and using English, and we're measuring their English language capabilities. So the next question is, or the next factor is delivery channel, right? So delivery channel is all about where you take the test. And that's where the balance comes in between access and security. So I'm seeing a couple of comments here talking about cheating and things like that. And that is correct, right? There is, if you don't have test centers, there will be cheating, right? Or there's a potential for cheating. But once again, there is an access issue. So I'll give you an example of a global online retailer that we do testing for. Everyone that works in one of their call centers takes an English language test from Pearson. They recruit hundreds of thousands of people a year. They can't afford to send 300,000 people into test centers to take an English language test every time they want to apply for a job. That is just not an acceptable situation for them, right? They just can't scale it, they can't afford it. So the decision they've made is they will allow the student to take the test from home, knowing that there is a chance that the student might cheat. However, they're willing to take the risk because security has to be compromised, right? Or sorry, has to be balanced with access. They need to be able to have hundreds of thousands of people take the test anywhere in the world. And by allowing greater access, they are compromising a little bit of test security. And that's a personal decision they made, right? Others may not be willing to do that, may not want to do that. But once again, it's not black and white. It's different for every situation and different for every use case. Now, one thing to keep in mind is remote proctoring is changing that, right? Remote proctoring is changing that equation. About 6 months back, we launched remote proctoring for one of our assessments called Pearson. And today, Pearson can be delivered both through a remote proctored environment and through a regular institutional-based or home-based environment. And once again, having that choice is what's important so that everyone can determine what is right for the situation and what makes most sense. Obviously, one of the other things to keep in mind is if you want greater test security, right? The greatest test security is in the context of a standardized environment, right? So I could have a small camera back here recording every interaction. If I go into test center and the test center is controlled and managed, the chance of that happening is a lot less, or pretty much zero. But once again, and we'll talk about this a little bit in more detail, as the rigor and access goes up, there are some trade-offs to be made around price, around risk, and so on and so forth. And once again, the push and pull comes in, and you have to determine for your situation what makes most sense. The next factor is outcomes, right? It's about understanding what are you trying to do with the results? How are they going to be used? Is the assessment tied to learning? Is it tied to a certification that results in a job or migration or international immigration? How quickly do you need the results? Those are all factors that have come into play, and based on that, you get to decide, right, what assessment you want to take. It's really important to make sure you're drawing the right inferences from the assessment. And I'll give you examples of some of the products that we have and how an English language test can be tailored to provide different types of information depending on the situation. Now, in many of our assessments, the speed of score turnaround is very, very important. So as an example, this online company retailer that I just spoke about, they're looking to hire people on the spot, right, or within hours. They can't afford to wait 4, 5, 6 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks for assessment results, because on the basis of the English language proficiency, they get to move to the next step of the interview process, the other assessments, and so on and so forth. And so the speed of that is very, very important to them. So in this case, we use our AI-based spoken scoring and written scoring capabilities to produce scores really, really quickly. And so that's the other thing that comes into mind, is determining how quickly do you need the results and what is the impact of waiting 3 days, 4 days, a week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks to get your results. So I'm going to share with you score reports and test outcomes for a few different tests. And hopefully you'll get a sense of how those results are used in different scenarios and how that should impact what assessment you go with. So these are results from one of our tests called the Level test, right? So Level is, think of it as a placement test. It's a quick test, right? It's a 20 to 25 minute 4 skills assessment. Now, in truth, even though it is an adaptive assessment, we can only draw a certain number of inferences and conclusions based on such a short test. And as a result, I have confidence providing you with a band of what your score is. So I can tell you you're a B1 plus, or you might be a B2, but I don't have enough confidence to give you a 42 versus a 43 versus a 44. And here what we've done is we've balanced the need of providing a relatively short test with a band, right? Because you're placing students and all you need to know is, are they a B1 plus, or are they A1 or an A2 or a C2 as an example. And that is the balance that we are striking there with regard to this level or placement test that is used for entrance purposes into English programs and so on and so forth. So the need here is to say, I have an English intensive program and I need to place students at the right class. That's what a level test does. You just need to tell me whether it's a B1 or B2 or a C1, so I know how to stream students. On the other hand, if you are interested in a much deeper understanding of a student's profile, so a student is part of your English courseware or a part of your English course, or your English program, and you are measuring progress along the way, something like a benchmark test makes a lot more sense. So this is an hour-long test. It's a 4 skills, integrated skills assessment, integrated skills English assessment. But the output that you get from there is much more granular. It's much more detailed. Not only does it provide you scores for reading, listening, writing, and speaking, it starts to provide you a link to the learning objectives. So what skills have you demonstrated? And more importantly, it actually provides you recommendations for improvement tied to specific activities. So if you're a teacher, you now get a very detailed understanding of a student's English proficiency. So you know what are their strengths, and more importantly, how you need to tailor the activities they're going to be focused on in the future to improve their learning. And not only do you get this for a particular student, you get it for the whole class. So at a class level, you can get a really quick snapshot of where your students are strong and where your students aren't as strong. So you know this is where you need to focus your efforts. So that's an example of how teachers are using a benchmark type test, an hour-long test, to get a lot more detail. And this is the type of test you would use for progression purposes, right? So multiple times within a course or a semester to be able to track, are your students moving and making progress or not? And similarly, here is the result of a readiness test. A readiness test here is a test that is used to prepare for high-stakes certification exams, right? So if you are going in for a high-stakes certification exam that takes 2 to 3 hours, what you need to know before going in is, are you ready to take the test and reduce anxiety and provide confidence that you are good to go, right? And that's exactly what the score report provides. The readiness test provides a score report that says, you as a student are ready in writing, but not as ready in speaking. So you know that your writing skills are great, but here's some activities you need to do before you go in and take the real test to improve your speaking. And what this test is meant to provide is give you an experience of what to expect on test day, but more importantly, reduce your anxiety and give you confidence that when you go in and take the test, that you are going to do well. So here's an example of 3 score reports of 4 skills English tests. And while they are all measuring similar items, they are trying to do things slightly differently, and the type of data, inferences, and scores that you get from the score reports will be tied to the use case. And that's why it's important to know what product you're using, what conclusions you're trying to draw from it, so that you're not misinterpreting the results that you're getting. So that was thinking about outcomes and results. So let's talk about the risk, right? I've seen a couple comments come through about malpractice and security. And that's absolutely a concern, right? That's a concern anytime there is an assessment being taken, there is a risk of malpractice. The question there is, who is responsible for the malpractice? Who is on point to make sure that malpractice is reduced? And I'll give you 2 scenarios, right? The first scenario is a university that uses an English test for placement purposes. And essentially what they're doing is they have either a classroom setting, or they might have a home setting through remote proctoring where they actually have a student going in and taking a test. And in that case, what the institution is doing is they're either watching the students, right? And they're watching them in the classroom or in the lab, and they're taking the test, at which point the university or the institution or the invigilator is actually responsible for managing malpractice and reporting malpractice. On the other hand, if we're doing remote monitoring, right? Or if you're going into a Pearson test center to take a test, the responsibility for managing malpractice, reporting and tracking malpractice is on Pearson, right? So in that case, you have 2 different scenarios where in one case, the institution accepts responsibility, and in the second case, Pearson accepts the responsibility. If you look at our flagship product, PT Academic, which is used for migration and college entrance, we have hundreds of locations all around the world. They are standardized test centers. They are mostly run by Pearson staff, and they are very, very consistent in terms of how we deliver the test, what security practices we use, the photographs that we take, the palm vein we use to manage who's taking the test, checking identification, and so on and so forth. And that's important because The certificate that you get at the end of a PT academic test is a certificate that has currency. And that's the certificate that helps you get a job, helps you go to Harvard, helps you go to Australia as a new immigrant, and so on and so forth. The risk of malpractice is high. But that's why we deliver it in very controlled environments, because we want to make sure that anyone walking around with a certificate is not doing so through unethical means. All right, so that's, once again, that's a risk of the push and pull, right, that comes into play. But as risk goes up, and as you need more locations in standardized delivery models, the price goes up, right? So the longer a test, the greater the security requirements, the higher the risk profile, generally equates to more expensive tests. So somebody might be willing to pay $200 or $250 to take a English test for immigration purposes. I'm sure no institution is willing to pay $250 to take a English placement test, because the profile of that test is different. And that's where you have to balance those needs, right? Is in what cases are you willing to accept a higher price for the benefits those higher price tests provide, versus a test that has a lower price, which may not have the same security or risk profile as a test that is delivered in a standardized testing environment in third-party test centers with all sorts of fancy security and so on and so forth. It's also important to keep in mind who is bearing the cost of the product, right? Is the institutional buying it? Is the test taker buying it, right? Is the university paying for it, or is the student paying for it? Do the parents have a decision to make in funding that? And that's where you really have to understand who your population is, how does the test need to be used, and how will you be, and what outcomes that test is going to result in. So what I did was I took those 7 outcomes, or 7 factors, sorry, and I plotted them on what I'm calling a spider chart here, right? And the spider chart really gives you a sense of helping you prioritize what are the things that are most important to you, right? So if you think of a scale of 1 to 10 and determine of all those 7 things, which things are really important and which things aren't as important, right? So you could take a spider profile like that and say, you know, test length is very important to me. I need a really, really short test because I need to deliver it within a 20-minute period. And if that's the case, then you know how to prioritize that, and you're willing to give up on other things that aren't as important. On the other hand, if test security is super critical and you want to make sure that it is delivered in really secure standardized test centers, then you have different choices that you have to make, including less access, right? Because in order to have test centers, you may not have test centers in every location all over the world. And so this kind of a spider chart really helps you visualize what are the critical things that you want to consider as part of your decision-making process, and really align with you and your stakeholders to ensure that you're prioritizing the right items. So the last thing I want to leave you with is an example here. Here are 3 products within the Pearson English portfolio. And like I said before, they all measure English, they all 4 skills tests, they all do a darn good job doing that. However, going to the push and pull, you may choose product number 1, 2, or 3, depending on what is important. So as an example, PT Academic, our flagship product, which is used by immigration and government agencies, as well as universities all over the world, is a highly secure, highly standardized test, right? It is the certificate that you get from PT Academic has currency in order to get you into a new country for immigration purposes or apply to a university. It's delivered in standardized locations, but as such, it has fewer locations. Even though it's available on demand 365 days out of the year, you can be in Minneapolis, where I am, and find a test center. But if you go 3 hours north of here, you may not find a test center because it's a rural area of Minnesota. On the other hand, the Versant English Placement Test is a test that is not delivered in a standardized environment. It can be taken from home, it can be taken in institutions, it can be taken in job locations. So it is not a standardized delivery model at all, but it provides you the benefit of taking it from anytime and anywhere. As such, the security isn't as stringent, and the security is actually determined by the institution delivering the test. And so those are the push and pull factors that you have to consider. It's not as simple as saying, hey, I want PT Academic. Great, you want PT Academic. Are you okay with having 500 locations to take a test versus Versant, where you have infinite number of locations? Are you okay paying $250 for a PT Academic test and all the benefits you get with it? Or do you only want to pay $25 for a Versant test? And so those are the kind of things you have to consider, because when you go back to the spider chart, you can't get really good security, ubiquitous delivery in thousands and thousands of locations, really, really short test at a really cheap price. Those things don't actually, they're incongruent. And so that's why you have to decide what are things that are most important to you and what items you can compromise on. And so that's what I'm going to leave you with, right? Work with understanding your student population, working with your stakeholders, determine what's most important to you, right? Why are you testing people? What can you compromise on and what can't you compromise on? Make sure you know what you can implement, right? So if you want to deliver a digital test because you want scores right away and you want all this data, make sure people have access to tablets or people have access to computers or whatever it may make sense for them to have. Make sure you're interpreting the results correctly. So if you're taking a 20-minute test, know that you can only draw certain inferences and conclusions from a short test versus a test that is a little bit longer. And hopefully the last 30 minutes has given you the types of questions you need to ask and the things you need to consider in order to select a test that is right for you and your students. So that was it. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, but I have about 5 minutes where I'm happy to answer any questions that might have come through.
Great, thank you, Nick. Yet again, a fantastic and very interesting webinar there. We have had a couple of questions come through, so let's give it a go, shall we? So one's about the language used in the tests. So I'm not sure if you know why certain language was chosen for the tests, but the question is, do we use this type of language, this difficult vocabulary in our daily English conversation? So I'm not sure, Nick, if you know what the sort of process was for choosing the certain language, or perhaps you've chosen examples from a high-level test of some sort.
Yeah, so it's important to keep in mind that every test that I referred to goes all the way from measuring a beginner's English, right? So A1 on the CEFR to C2. And our tests are designed in a way that they can actually measure English proficiency across the spectrum, right? So the situations I'm giving as an example, you might have a progress test as an example that you can start using when students are just beginning to learn English. So there might be an A1, A2, and as they progress in the English language proficiency, you give them tests at a higher level, right? So the test is actually designed to measure across the range of the spectrum. On the other hand, some of the examples I'm talking about, if you have to work in a environment where English is used to support customers as a call center agent, or you are going into university where you're learning or taking classes in an English medium environment, you have to meet a certain threshold of English attainment, and that is actually set usually by the institution, by the university, by the immigration department, by the company.
Brilliant. And I think there's a bridge question to that, and I don't want to open up a new can of worms here, but I think, is it adaptive testing that's the technology behind this?
It depends. So some tests that we have are adaptive, right? So I talked a little bit about our level test, right? The level test is the one that is used for placement purposes. That's a 20-minute test. That is an adaptive test. The benchmark test is not an adaptive test. And the reason is because when you buy a benchmark or use a benchmark test, you actually pick a level. So you don't need adaptivity because by default, the test is constrained within a certain band of English attainment. So you would be picking a B1 test as an example versus a level because you have no idea what level they're at. You actually have an adaptive test and it uses adaptive algorithms to determine what your level is on the CEFR.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a few more here. Where's this gone now? Excuse me, sorry, I've just lost the note of it. Oh yes, so what about course mapping? Do any of these tests here provide a course mapping feature?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yes, they do. And it's one of the big benefits of digital assessments, right? Is I'm not sure you can see it, but actually when you get a score from the benchmark test here or the readiness test as an example, and you can probably see it in the course mapping on the left side of the screen, is you can select what course you are using. And based on that course mapping, it's able to actually provide you and point you specific activities you need to do within the course to actually focus your English language remediation. And that's a big benefit of digital assessments, right? Not only can we produce scores right away, but we can really bring to life the data. What I tell people quite frequently is that the number or the score is sometimes the least meaningful piece of the score report. And things like a summary of your strengths and weaknesses or course mapping that allows you to look at specific activities that you should be focused on within a course book to really remediate and improve your English is sometimes a lot more meaningful and more beneficial.
Brilliant.
Thank you for that question. Yep.
Good. We've had one more in, but I think I'm not sure your best place to answer it, Nick. But it's when will computer-based tests be available again? PT exam centres have all been closed, and the exams have been called off this year, meaning there's no possible solution to keep on assessing students due to the pandemic. So what's your response to that, Nick? Is it a case that they need to speak to local reps, or is it a fact that as these are online, they can still be sat?
So it's a combination. So I don't know which PTE exams you're referring to, but PTE academic exams are available in some countries, and it's really about PTE academic exams are digital exams, and they are delivered in test centers all over the world. And they are only shut if local regulations and lockdowns are preventing test centers from opening. In many countries, the exams are available, but in other countries, they're not available because the locations are closed because of local regulations. On PTE General, which is our paper-based test, those tests are moving to computer-based middle of next year. It has been quite unfortunate because of the pandemic. A lot of the tests have had to either be canceled or rescheduled, but we are ready to go just as soon as local regulations and lockdowns open up. But we are excited about launching computer-based testing by middle of next year, including remote proctoring to enable greater access to those tests. And hopefully we will be out of the pandemic by then.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. Well, that's unfortunately all we have time for on the questions front. I will highlight that I pinned my colleague Sophia's comment on the top of the chat box where there is a URL to the assessment page on pearsonenglish.com. If you scroll down halfway through that page, you will find all of the tests that Nick has talked about today. They're listed. And if you follow to the web pages, you'll be able to find contact details, and you can speak to local ELT consultants who should be able to advise you on what tests can and can't be taken currently. So Nick, thank you once again for your session. It was inspiring and interesting as always.
Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. And to all of you attendees, thank you so much for joining us today. And we do hope to see you at another Pearson English webinar very soon. Have a good day and stay safe. Goodbye.